folks. So today we're going to be getting introduced to a really interesting and important, one of the most interesting and important ideas in the history of ethical philosophy. And it comes from this fellow right here, the 18th century German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. So the idea that we're going to get a grip on today is the concept of the categorical imperative. Now, here's why we need the concept of the categorical imperative to understand Kant. And in a certain way, we can put Kant's theory in contrast with utilitarian theories that we've already learned about. The utilitarian says doing the right thing is ultimately a matter of consequences, right? You're doing the right thing, and you can be judged a morally good person when you do what you can to make the world a better place, right? So it's all about what results from your actions are you making the world a happier place. So this is the question we might wonder. Should we judge people for the consequences of their behaviors? That is, how things turn out? Interestingly, Kant tells us no. Now, why does he tell us this? Well, let's look at something that Kant actually wrote for us. So this comes from his book, The Groundwork to the Metaphysics of Morals. Here's what Kant says. Let's try to take this step by step and break it down. He says, "The good will is good, not through what it affects or accomplishes, not through its efficacy for attaining any intended end, but only through its willing, i.e., good in itself." So, what he's saying is that a good will is good in and of itself, whereas consequences aren't necessarily good in and of themselves. And he's going to say we admire how a person wills instead of what their will accomplishes. He elaborates. Even if through the peculiar disfavor of fate, or through the meager endowment of a stepmotherly nature. I think he's saying, how the evil stepmother doesn't give you everything you want or need. He's saying, imagine if nature is acting like this kind of evil stepmother. He says, you could have bad luck. So you might have a good will, good aims, but you could lack the resources, you could have bad luck from nature. If with its greatest effort, nothing of it were to be accomplished, and if only the goodwill were left over. Now, he makes an important qualification in this parenthetical. To be sure, not a mere wish, but as the summoning up of all the means insofar as they are in our control. So he seems to be saying, look, if you make a true effort to do the right thing, and even if things don't turn out then we would say there is still a good will left over. And what can we say about a person in a situation like this? We say that their goodwill would shine like a jewel for itself. It's something good and valuable and admirable in its own right. Something that has full worth in itself. Utility or fruitlessness, utility, just another word for usefulness or effectiveness, and fruitlessness, the lack thereof of usefulness or effectiveness, can neither add nor subtract anything from the worth of your willing. So Kant has a really interesting and powerful idea here. Your actions can still have worth even if they don't bring about a good consequence. Some examples? Well, sure, we might be able to think of cases where we say, yeah, things didn't turn out right, but A for effort. So we might think about the case of the surgeon who does everything to save their patient, but who doesn't succeed in the end. Or we might also think about a soldier heroically dying in battle, doing everything that they can to fight for the right cause. And in that process, they might not gain an inch of ground for their side. But if they summoned up all their means insofar as they were in their control, we would say that is somebody to be admired and honored still. So he's saying, okay, so we need goodwill. It's not just results, but it's about having the right intention. So the question we then need to ask is, well, what is it to have a goodwill? And Kant here will tell us, you have a goodwill when you act from a sense of duty, right? The idea here is that when we're thinking about acting from duty, it's doing the right thing, but not just doing the right thing. You're acting from duty when you do the right thing for the right reasons, okay? So the thought is going to be, there's a difference between following your moral duties and merely conforming to them. We can give an example of somebody who keeps their promises on the one hand because they realize that I made a promise and it's the right thing to do to follow through on my word. But we could imagine another person keeping their promise because they don't want their friend to get mad at them, or they know it will be more inconvenient in the long run not to keep the promise. Well, in the first case, if you do it because you think this is just the right thing to do, that's following your duty. But if you keep your promise just randomly or for a non-moral incentive, like not feeling uncomfortable or not wanting to be further inconvenienced, that's not following, but that's conformity to your duty. Kant says that if we want to really know if somebody is acting according to their duty, we should look at cases where somebody does the right thing even when their inclinations, that is, their desires, are against doing that right thing. So these often involve cases where doing the right thing is hard. You might think about a case like when Martin Luther King was making the march to Selma, Alabama, and had to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And he knew that previously police had beaten and injured protesters trying to cross this bridge. But instead of stopping and going back, what did King do? Well, King proceeded. And this is something that we could think of as like profound moral courage. It's not going to be easy or fun to do the right thing, but we do the right thing because we know it's the right thing and we know it's what we have to do. That's really the idea of doing the right thing and doing it for the right reasons. And it's most clearly evident in these cases where doing the right thing goes against our inclinations. So if our moral duties aren't based on inclination, they're based on reason. So now we're building up a more complex story, right? We judge people for their goodwill and not their consequences of their actions. And then we say, well, what is goodwill? It's acting out of duty. And what is acting out of duty? Well, it is conforming your will to reason, right? It's making a choice because you realize that reason commands you to do it. So this leads us to the thought that when we think about morality, we're thinking about commandments not just of what you feel like doing, but what you know you have to do. And we're going to go deeper into the sense in which these moral duties are commandments of reason. We'll bring in some terminology from Kant here. He says that if reason is telling you to do something, you have an obligation. Kant's word for this is an imperative, right? So it's saying, on the pain of irrationality. So if you don't follow the imperative, you can be called irrational. You're being said to be making a mistake. And he's going to say, when we fail to not only conform, but follow the rules of practical rationality, we are breaking our imperatives, right? We are being irrational. Now, we need to also be clear that there are two kinds of imperatives for Kant. One of them is separate from morality, and one of them is central and essential to morality. So here's the first kind of imperative that Kant tells us about. And this kind of imperative is called a hypothetical imperative. So a hypothetical imperative is a commandment of reason. So we would say if you don't follow your hypothetical imperatives, you are being irrational. But it's an obligation to do what it takes in order to get what you care about. So this is a big part of rationality, you might think. So for instance, if you want to have money, you're going to track your spending. And if you want to be healthy, you're going to eat good food and exercise sometimes. Or one more example, if you want to renew your vehicle registration in states like North Carolina, where we are, you'll realize that you have to get your vehicle inspected if you want to renew your vehicle registration. So the thought is, if you will this aim, renew your registration, you also have a rational requirement to do what it takes to get there, right? So we would say, if you really want to renew your registration, you're going to have to get your car inspected first. So that's an example of a hypothetical imperative. And you might notice that this kind of hypothetical imperative doesn't really seem to have a whole lot to do with morality. That doesn't really seem like what we're worried about when we think about the kind of goodwill that Martin Luther King was demonstrating when he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Right? So this gets us to a second kind of imperative for practical rationality. Practical rationality is just rationality about what you're going to do. This is what Kant calls a categorical imperative. So whereas the hypothetical imperative is about rationally getting what you want, the categorical imperative is about rationally figuring out what to do in a way that's independent of what you want. So he says that the categorical imperative is a commandment of reason to do something that applies to you no matter what you care about, what your desires are. Maybe you can think of an example of something that you have to do as a reasonable ethical agent, and a rule that applies to you independently of what your current desires happen to be. Well, here's one example that might strike you as really getting to the heart of Kant's point. You might think like, look, whether you want to or not, so you set your desires aside, there are some things that you're just morally obligated to do, right? You must never cheat on your spouse, for instance. So if you're married to somebody, and if you're not in some kind of open, non-monogamous marriage, you're going to have an obligation to not cheat on your spouse, right? The people in open marriages, certain actions that might count as cheating for some won't count as cheating for them. So we're going to say, like, look, when something actually counts as cheating, that's a rule you have to follow. And here's the thing, it's a rule you have to follow even if you really want to, right? Go back to the hypothetical imperative. Let's say you just decided you didn't want to renew your vehicle registration, right? Maybe you realized, I can just stop using that car. I'm going to walk to work and school. And maybe you realize, like, oh, I've got another way to get around. I don't want to renew my car anymore. And if you don't want to renew your car anymore, you don't anymore have an obligation or a rational imperative to get your vehicle inspected. So in this way, we can say that hypothetical imperatives, and this is built right into the definition, are contingent on what you care about. But for categorical imperatives, they're not at all contingent on what you care about. These are rules of acting reasonably that apply to you whether you do or don't, say, want to break that rule. So even if you really want to, you don't get to cheat on your spouse. So let's put this all together. We've introduced this interesting and important new concept for ethical philosophy called the categorical imperative. And it moves in steps, right? Kant told us that the worth of your actions is determined by whether you have a good will. And a person is acting from goodwill when they do the right thing for the right reasons. So you do the thing that morality requires you to do, and you do it because you see it as morally required. And here's the last point. Your moral duties are categorical imperatives, right? So that's to say that they rationally apply to you no matter what you happen to desire. So this is going to lead us to a further question. We might say, like, okay, so we've got these categorical imperatives. If I'm supposed to be acting out of duty towards these special rules, what are my specific moral obligations? And we'll spell that out by looking at the first two formulations, as Kant calls them, of the categorical imperative. And just to preview where we're going to go in the next two video clips, the first formulation says your behavior has to follow some rules of fairness, right? Kant's big idea is that rules for me are also going to be rules for you. After all, the rules apply to us independently of what we particularly have to care about. And here's the second rule. He's going to say, look, we are all equals. So you have to act out of respect for other persons. And for Kant, this is also going to mean not violating the autonomy of others. So that's a little preview of where we're going to go in our investigation of Kant's theory of the categorical imperative. So, thanks for listening.